Okay. So, hi, my name is Shruti. I'm a 17-year-old here in the US in Missouri, and I'm on Period's Youth Advisory Council. And today with us we have Aida, a wonderful author, and I'd like her to introduce herself too.
Sure. Yeah. Aida Salazar is my name, and I'm an author for children. I write for middle grade and younger. And I've written two books. One is called The Moon Within. It was my debut novel, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And here, I'll show you. It's it right there. See, The Moon Within. And actually, she's back there too. Same person. Um, and then I wrote Land of the Cranes, this one here. Yeah. And that's and this is my writing studio.
That's great. And just to start off once again, so how did you actually start doing your work in the menstrual equity space? How did you come up with the ideas that this is what you want to talk about?
Mm-hmm. Well, writing is my resistance. That's how I am active. That's how I exercise, mm, or deliver the ideas that I want to put out in the world and what I want to stand against. And so I've been a writer for a really long time, though only 2019 was my first book. I've been writing professionally since 1999. So it's been a 20-year journey, 20 plus year journey now. And so when my daughter was kind of coming of age, she was about 11 years old, and she was beginning to ask questions about her body. We started to look for books, of course, that would provide that information for her. And I gave her, of course, what I wanted to give her or what I knew to give her, but we couldn't find anything that was in the realm of fiction. There are dozens of books, and I think the feminist movement has done a lot to bring about education in nonfiction. So lots and lots of books about, you know, how to do XYZ, how to, explore your feelings, etc., etc. But there wasn't very much by way of story. And there was nothing for my Latina child. So I wanted to write something for her. So I wrote this story. But I have to say that The Moon Within, it comes from a very particular lens. It comes from my Mexican background, and I had practiced ritual and ceremony with women in circle around our connection to the moon and our menstruations. And so my daughter was raised in this environment, and she'd sat in circle and in ceremony with me as well. And we had also witnessed other people in our community do moon ceremonies, which is like a celebration of menstruation at the beginning as it starts. And so so I wanted to write the story that would be kind of the opposite. Like, what would happen if a child actually didn't want to do these kinds of ceremonies? And my daughter was into it. She really loved it. So I thought it would be funny to do that. But so I entered the space kind of like really wanting to provide something for my daughter, but not knowing that in literature overall, that there was hardly anything available for menstruators of all ethnicities and genders to uh, where they saw their menstruations reflected on the page. And so the last time that we ever saw something like that was in Judy Blume's Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret, which is an iconic book, but that book was written in 1971. So that's like generations of people who have not seen menstruation reflected in literature. And certainly, my book is the first for the Latina community and Latinx community to demonstrate it. So I entered it intending to provide something for my daughter, but not knowing that I was filling a much larger gap.
Well, I think one interesting thing you talked about there was how a lot of it's like celebration in itself. But I mean, with so many people, we see that our goal here is to also combat the stigma associated with it. So do you think, how does your book impact the menstrual equity space in that way?
So one of the intentions behind the book was to rewrite a narrative, right? We have this just kind of general narrative that says that our menstruations are dirty or to be feared or shamed or ignored. And that of course comes from patriarchy and puritanical views that are tied to religion. And and so, you know, part of the work of my book, I hope, is that it's trying to rewrite the narrative. The parents and this community in this book, they celebrate the moon, and the mother kind of almost exaggeratedly does so, and the child is like, no, I don't want to bare my soul in front of community, but really at the end of it, you know, the child, her name is Sally discovers that really is a source of power to understand not only how your cycle works and how your emotions and your inner workings kind of connect to something that is kind of bigger. And so the Moon Within is hoping to rewrite the narrative and push back against the stigma and normalize it. And I think it's part of a movement. It's not the only one, but it's part of a larger movement that is trying to rewrite that narrative.
Yeah, the ceremony sounds really interesting because personally, like in my own culture, we don't have anything like that, but I've seen that in many different cultures too. But for you at least, or for the Latinx community, do you see that this ceremony itself is in any way very common? Or if it is very common, is it common for kids not to want to participate or have feelings associated with it like that?
Yeah, no, actually, it's not. It's not very common because of colonization. You know, when the Europeans came to the Americas, they decimated culture, people, languages, and books. And so much of that history and those traditions were just gone. But they have survived through oral history. And so we know that these ceremonies have existed as an act of resistance by the people of the Americas, you know, through passing them down, you know, and being insular with this information. But Catholicism in the Americas has been, and Christianity has been so devastating that many of us, the majority of us, have forgotten what it is. But I'll say that in the research and the writing of this book, a friend of mine, David Bowles, Dr. David Bowles, he turned me on to this poem, and it's in one of the last surviving books, the Codexes of the Americas, and it's called Songs of the Spalches 7. And this codex was written in 1440 before European contact. And this book, this book of poems, inside of this book of poems, there is one poem, and it's called Flower Song for Maidens Coming of Age. And in that poem is the only existing documentation of a moon ceremony in the Americas, period. It's like, it's really a profound thing to have it. And luckily you know, it was published in this book. At the very end of the book, we were able to publish David Bowles' translation of that poem from the Nahuatl the Yucatec Maya, the Yucatec Maya to English. So these traditions have been there for a really long time. And so part of the work of this book is not only like pushing back against a patriarchal narrative, but also trying to remind people who have been colonized that you have these deep, beautiful traditions that have been erased because of colonization, that we have to reclaim and take ownership of again. So
That's amazing, the history of that, yeah. Well, so associated with that too, just menstrual equity in itself, because of all the deep history with it and how it's impacted more marginalized groups in there too negatively, how do you see that coming into context of social justice movements in general? Maybe specific to the US, but how do you see like the menstrual justice movement come into context with other social justice movements?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that menstrual justice is a question of human rights. It's a question of understanding that every single human being on the planet came from a menstruator. You know, there's nothing more primordial than life, right? Than giving birth and continuing the human race. And the only way that we can come about that is through menstruation. Until now, you know, but it really requires menstruations and menstruators to be able to go on with humanity. And so it behooves us to understand it, to take away the stigma, to support, to you know, rewrite this narrative that it doesn't matter, because it is part of a continuum of human rights, like reproductive justice. I think menstrual justice kind of it falls under the umbrella of reproductive justice, because without menstruation there is no reproduction. So I think that these um, you know, these distinctions that we've made in social justice, like, oh, that's like a woman's issue, you know, I mean, it's very limiting, because it only, you know, it believes that only women menstruate. It believes that it's somehow separate and still a taboo and not to be talked about, whereas where in reality and in actuality it needs to be part of the discussion, for human rights in general.
Yeah, and I think the great thing you talk about, and there's context too. Like all of these types of issues come with context as well, which I love in the way that the stories are presented too. Is that you're offering a fictional context then for kids to engage with, and stories for them to learn through as well. So, what importance do you think? I mean, obviously, you think there's much importance with this, but how much do you think history takes place in these types of movements as well, and how much we should look to like the history of culture to understand the movements that exist right now? What's your take on that?
On how history, well, I think that you know, again, you know, I go back to the devastation of colonization and how at what moments we were stripped of our knowledge and our power, and at what moments, you know, people who menstruate were disempowered, and then but also at what moments we have been rising, right? So I look at, as much as I look at history, to remember and reclaim our power, I think that it's really important also to see the moments and the movements that are happening on the ground right now, to kind of like to fortify our right, our right to be, you know, acknowledged and supported as menstruators in the world. So it's a dance, you know what I mean? I think that you can't not look at history, but at a certain point, you know, what are we going to do about it, right? We're gonna how are we going to change it? So
Yeah. And I think I'd also want to talk about your new novel, the one you showed, the Land of the Cranes one.
yeah.
And just could you just briefly explain, or just explain the relevance of this novel right now too, and about like the world we're living in right now and how important its story is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this book here, this one, Land of the Cranes, it's got kind of a bad light there. There you go. Land of the Cranes is about a little girl, and you'll see her here. She's a 9-year-old who's in a detention center. Her father was deported, and then when she and her mother try and go see him in San Diego at Friendship Park, they miss the last exit and they end up in Mexico. But when they try to come back, they're taken in. Their documentation isn't enough, and they're put in a ICE facility, and it's called a hielera, or the ice box. And she is a poet, and she is and she writes picture poems. That's her art practice, to show her feelings. And while in there, her attorney helps her begin to document what she's feeling and what she sees, to build her case for asylum. And while inside, she inspires other people inside the detention center to do the same, and their movement goes viral, and it helps change situation for them. But it's a very difficult story. I wrote it through many, many tears, and I wrote it to as a response to the terror that my community, the Latinx community, had been experiencing. I wrote it in March of 2018, and at the time, the Trump administration was really retaliating against California and other sanctuary cities where I live. And at one point in Northern California, where I live, the mayor of Oakland alerted the community that the ICE was going to be raiding the, in the vicinity, and doing sweeps. And so the community was terrified. It was just terrified. And so I wrote it in that context and in that fear, because I was undocumented as a child. I came over when I was 9 months old, and it wasn't until I was 12 that we got our green cards. But still, it was always kind of I spent my whole childhood very acutely aware of what, it meant to live in the shadows and not belong and not be documented. So this book it was a response to all that, but also because I knew that, like, in the Obama years, children who were coming to the border unaccompanied were being taken in, and they created these jails essentially for them. And so that all of that was in conversation when I wrote the book. And my hope is that the book helps to inspire people to challenge the human rights abuses that are happening still to this day, at this moment, for migrants who are detained at the border and across the United States. And this child has agency. She writes her picture poems, and it's a way to resist and how to find light in your darkest hour. And that's what I hope for people to take away from this book.
Yeah, I mean, it's like yours too. You say that writing is your way of resistance in there, and well, through that too, how do you inspire hope in youth through your novels and through your writing too? The way that you resist, how does the hope translate from that?
Mm-hmm. Well, with this one, with The Moon Within, because it was so much about the negativity, pushing back against the negativity and the stigma that we see so much against menstruators. And I was hoping that this book would empower youth, and empower others, to say, oh my goodness, this doesn't have to be a negative thing. This does not have to be something that I'm ashamed of. This is something that makes me special. In fact, makes me special because I have a biological connection to the moon, and it's beautiful. And so I was hoping that this book would do that. A child would say, wow, there's power in my menstruation. And for the second book, again, I was just hopeful that people could see, their readers could see it and say, like, you know what, this is a roadmap. If this child in this very dark circumstance was able to do this, then I can too. And I can stand up and stand against and shut down forces that are deeming people illegal, when, we're the ones who wrote drew the line in the sand, who created the borders, when really, if we look at migration, the history of migration, that's how we populated the world, right? And it's us who have created these borders and these barriers and made people criminals when they cross these borders. So my hope is activism in this book, in The Moon Within, a personal activism, and then the other one is kind of personal, but also out. I guess both is the same way. Personal starts there, right? It starts with you as a person, and then how you project out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I personally wish the Moon Within book was around when I was younger. I think that would have been a great read for me specifically too, but
Yeah, a lot of people say that. I was recently invited to come to a book club
mm,
where they read The Moon Within, and I was like, well, okay, well, interesting. And The Moon Within was written for middle grades, which is like literally 8 to 13 years old, right? But these were adult women who were reading the book. It was like a women's club and a book club, and they were just so appreciative. And they said that they also wish that they had had that book when they were coming into their menstruation, because it was kind of healing. It was a healing, because so many folks in the Latinx community, and I think in the world really, have such a difficult time with just accepting it. And then not to mention, we have lost a lot of the medicinal ways that we can deal with menstruation. Now, so many of us deal with painful periods and backaches and nausea, and what have you. All these symptoms that that before were treated with herbs and with diet and with exercise and massage and uterine massage and all of this beautiful wisdom that we just don't have anymore. And so these women were like, thank you for this book. I needed this book, and when I was younger. And so I think that in many ways, I wrote this book for me too, because I grew up in a very Catholic, very strict environment where that was not the case. And so it took me a really long time to seek out and to find people in my community, elders in my community. And of course, there were no books, right? There's no books that could tell me this information. So it was through elders and being in community with other menstruators that I was able to find that. So I have to say also that my book is one of many, right? Like, so I just going to show you my period stack. I'm very proud of it. So look at all this, right? Like, these are great books that just came out in the last 2 years. So I think that in terms of literature, we're making great some great movement, and these are stories, except for this one, but we're doing a great job, I think, to try and dispel it. And I'll say one other thing that I'm doing that I'm really proud of, and that's that we put together another anthology. Another writer, her name is Jamile Said Mendez, and I are co-editing a book called Calling the Moon, though the title might change. And it's an anthology by middle grade writers of color with stories about menstruation, so that The Moon Within is not the only one, right? Like, so that we continue to hear from other cultures and other communities about what it means to menstruate and how powerful a thing it can be. So
No, that's amazing. I mean, I know personally for me, or for Indian culture in general, I've seen some ceremonies where it's like celebration again, where it's like a coming of age type of ritual, and for some where it's like, I mean, almost like punishment in some case. Like I've heard, like you have to drink raw eggs or like stay by yourself and things like that. So it's really interesting to learn about different cultures and where they come from too. And I think this anthology, that's like amazing to hear from so many different perspectives. I mean, that's great work. But just to end off, I guess, is there one call of action that you'd like to share to everyone who's watching? Just one takeaway thing that everybody should do?
well, I think I was thinking that maybe I was thinking that maybe the best thing to do is to join with other people who have started this work, like period, the movement, that and other organizations who are already doing the work. And if you can't find your space within the movements that are already doing the work, I would say start your own. get a few of your friends together and start your own. I think that is the most, that we are part of a movement, that nobody is a silo, and if the moment that we build alliances and that we work as a collective towards this dispelling of the stigma and the empowerment of menstruators, I think that the further we'll go.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's great. That's amazing. That's all that we have for today. But thank you so much for coming
Oh, thank
and
you.
answering these questions too. It's been a pleasure to know more about you and those books too. And I'll make my sister, who's that age, get into these books too and read them. I'll read them alongside her. But thank you
Yeah,
so much.
you're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.